Imagine waking up before sunrise. The air is calm. The earth is cool beneath your feet. You hear goats bleating, children laughing, the quiet rhythm of village life. Then suddenly, screams, smoke rises, footsteps thunder toward your home. By sunset, you are no longer free. Your hands are tied. Your family is gone. Your name will soon be taken from you. This was not just one story. This was millions. Today we are exploring the entire history of slavery in Africa, from ancient times to the transatlantic trade, to modern chains that still exist. This is not just history. This is humanity. Stay with me. When many people think of slavery in Africa, they immediately think of Europeans and ships crossing the Atlantic. But slavery existed in Africa long before Europeans arrived. Now pause. That does not mean it was the same kind of slavery we later saw. In many ancient African societies, slavery was often a result of war between kingdoms, debt, punishment for crimes, or famine survival. If a kingdom defeated another in war, prisoners could be taken as slaves. But here's the key difference. In many African societies, slaves could marry, own property, earn freedom, become part of the family, and sometimes even rise to positions of power. It was often more like forced servitude, not permanent race-based dehumanization. For example, in parts of West Africa, a slave could eventually become integrated into the clan. Slavery was harsh. It was painful. But it was not yet the brutal racial system the world would later see. That change was coming. In the 7th century, something shifted. With the expansion of Arab empires and the spread of Islam, trade networks grew across North Africa and into the Middle East. And along with gold, salt, and ivory came people. This became known as the Trans-Saharan slave trade. Millions of Africans were taken across the Sahara Desert. Imagine walking across a burning desert for weeks. No water, no shade, no escape. Many died before reaching the markets. Those who survived were sold in North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Men were often forced into labor or military service. Women were often taken as domestic servants or concubines. Over centuries, millions of Africans were trafficked through these routes. This trade lasted far longer than the transatlantic slave trade, and yet, it is rarely discussed. Then, in the 15th century, new ships appeared on the West African coast. Portuguese explorers were the first. At first, they came for gold, then ivory, then spices, and then human beings. European demand for labor in the Americas was growing fast. Sugar plantations in Brazil, tobacco fields in Virginia, cotton plantations in the Caribbean. These crops made enormous profits, but they required massive labor. And so began one of the darkest chapters in human history: the transatlantic slave trade. At first, Europeans relied on African middlemen and coastal kingdoms to supply captives. Some African rulers participated in the trade. Some resisted it. Some were forced into it. It is important to understand this clearly. Europeans created the massive demand. They built the ships. They financed the voyages. They developed the racial ideology that justified permanent hereditary slavery based on skin color. But the system grew so large that it pulled in multiple African states, creating cycles of war and kidnapping. Communities that once traded goods began trading people. Firearms were exchanged for captives. The more guns a kingdom had, the more powerful it became. The more powerful it became, the more wars it fought. And the cycle fed itself. Now imagine the Middle Passage. You are forced onto a ship. Your wrists and ankles are chained. You are packed tightly below deck. lying shoulder to shoulder with strangers. There is almost no air. The smell of sweat, blood, vomit, and death fills the space. You cannot sit up fully. You cannot move freely. You cannot escape. Some ships carried 300, 400, even 600 people at once. The journey lasted weeks, sometimes months. Disease spread quickly. If someone died, their body might remain beside you for hours, sometimes days, before being thrown overboard. Many chose to jump into the ocean rather than endure the suffering. Historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Millions more died during capture, forced marches, and the sea journey. This was not migration. This was industrialized human trafficking. When enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas, they entered a system unlike most forms of slavery that had existed before. This slavery was racial. It was permanent. It was inherited. If you were born to an enslaved mother, you were automatically enslaved, no matter what. Your skin color marked you for life. Families were separated and sold. Names were changed. Languages were forbidden. Drums were banned in some regions because they were used to communicate. People were treated as property, bought, sold, insured, mortgaged, punished, whipped for working too slowly, whipped for speaking their language, whipped for trying to learn to read. But here is something powerful. They resisted. Resistance took many forms. Some rebelled openly, like the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolution in history, which created the first Black Republic in 1804. Some ran away and formed free communities called Maroons. Some resisted quietly, preserving their languages, music, religion, and stories. Even under unimaginable oppression, African culture survived. It shaped the Americas forever. Music, food, religion, language, art, from jazz to samba, from blues to reggae, from spirituals to gospel. The legacy of Africa could not be erased. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, abolition movements began to grow. Formerly enslaved people spoke out. Writers published powerful testimonies. Activists organized campaigns. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade. In 1833, slavery was abolished in most of the British Empire. In the United States, slavery ended in 1865 after a brutal civil war. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, one of the last countries in the Americas to do so. But here is something important. Ending slavery did not end inequality. Freedom came without land, without compensation, without protection. In many places, formerly enslaved people were pushed into systems that looked different, but felt similar. Sharecropping, forced labor, colonial exploitation, and speaking of colonialism, as the transatlantic slave trade declined, European powers shifted focus. They began colonizing Africa itself. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European nations divided Africa like a cake, drawing borders without African consent. Colonial rule extracted resources, controlled labor, and reshaped African societies. In some regions, forced labor systems continued well into the 20th century. And now we must confront a difficult truth. Slavery did not completely disappear. Today, modern slavery still exists. Human trafficking, forced labor, child labor in mines and farms, forced domestic servitude, debt bondage. According to global estimates, tens of millions of people worldwide are trapped in modern forms of slavery, not only in Africa, but across the world. The chains may not always be made of iron anymore. Sometimes they are made of poverty, corruption, conflict, lack of education, desperation. So what do we learn from this history? First, slavery in Africa was complex. It existed before Europeans, but in different forms. The Arab slave trade lasted over 1,000 years. The transatlantic slave trade racialized and industrialized slavery on an unprecedented scale. African societies were both victims and, at times, participants under pressure and changing power dynamics. But above all, the greatest responsibility lies with the systems that created global demand, racial hierarchy, and generational dehumanization. Second, the resilience of African people is extraordinary. Despite centuries of displacement and oppression, African descendants shaped global culture, politics, religion, and art. They survived, they resisted, they endured, and they transformed the world. When we talk about slavery, we are not just talking about the past. We are talking about systems, about power, about human value, about what happens when profit becomes more important than people. History is not meant to make us feel guilty. It is meant to make us aware. Because awareness creates responsibility, and responsibility creates change. The story of slavery in Africa is not just a story of suffering. It is also a story of survival, of strength, of identity that refused to die. And that story is still being written.